Welcome to the Wisdom of the Body Summit, an online event to align with your body's intelligence for healing, optimal living, and spiritual awakening. Brought to you by Sounds True. Throughout this summit, 32 experts will share practical tools and breakthrough insights that have emerged from the convergence of science and time-honored perspectives from the world's spiritual traditions. As we learn to recognize and honor the incredible wealth of knowledge that lies within our bodies, we can begin to listen and attend to ourselves more fully, opening a doorway to greater health and well-being. Hi, everybody. Today, I am excited to welcome epigenetics researcher, award-winning author, and emotional freedom technique expert, Dawson Church. For this session, Dawson will be sharing a presentation that's entitled, Why Talk is Not Enough. Welcome, Dawson.
Christy, wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me.
We're excited to have you with us. Thank you.
So I titled this, Why Talk is Not Enough, because we're a really verbal society. We talk about our problems, and the whole foundation of both psychotherapy and coaching as a way to solve our problems is to talk about them. The classical idea of therapy is to go to your therapist's office, to sit on the couch, to have an hour-long session, to explain what's bothering you, maybe get some strategies for how you can shift that. Coaching follows very similar models, often online, but in person sometimes as well. And so the idea is that by speaking about our problems, we can solve them. And Sigmund Freud said, what he said was that the essence of the talking cure was that talk produces insight, and insight produces change. About that, when it comes to trauma, Freud was completely wrong, because what talking about trauma produces often is more trauma. And this is a term that was invented in the 1980s by a psychologist called Charles Figley, which is re-traumatization. Talking about things re-traumatizes you. So one of Freud's disciples was a famous psychiatrist after World War II called Joseph Wolpe. And Joseph Wolpe wrote a book called The Practice of Behavior Therapy. And he was tasked after World War II with working with these soldiers with shell shock. They'd come back from the trenches of Normandy or North Africa. They had this condition known as shell shock, which we now call PTSD. And Wolpe's job was to treat these soldiers. And being a good Freudian, he laid them on the couch and said, let's talk about that. And they talked about their problems, and he actually became an anti-Freudian because Wolpe wrote in his book, he said, the practice of talking about trauma is not only unhelpful, it is actually harmful. And for many people, they actually re-traumatize themselves by recounting their stories of loss, of the death of a child, of the dissolution of a marriage, of losing a job, of a house being lost to the recession, some big disaster. They may have been in a car crash. They may have been in combat. They may have been assaulted. And by talking about these things, you may actually be re-traumatizing yourself. So PTSD is one of those problems where talking about trauma usually is counterproductive. And that's why I say talk is not enough, and what you need is a therapy that gets below the surface and works on those problems. I'll tell you a story from my book, The EFT Manual. I wrote the newest edition of the EFT Manual. It's the 4th edition of the book. And in it, I tell the story of a veteran from Vietnam. He was in Vietnam in the late 1960s. He was discharged in the early 1970s, came back to the US, and over the time, his PTSD symptoms got worse and worse and worse. Now, if you look at the research on depression, for example, depression tends to have a start, middle, and end. According to the National Institute's Mental health, an episode of depression lasts on average 8 or 9 months. So a bad thing happens, you get depressed, but 8 or 9 months later, if you receive psychotherapy, if you receive good counseling, usually you'll get better. Unless you take medication. Medication can prolong the depression or make you dependent on antidepressants. But if you don't get medication, then usually 8 or 9 months later, you're back to baseline. With PTSD, not like that. PTSD often gets worse over time. And so, for example, in one study of World Trade Center first responders, they found that half of the cases of PTSD in those people who responded to the disaster of 9/11, half the cases were what's called delayed onset PTSD. 6 months after the World Trade Center disaster, those firefighters and emergency workers, they look fine. 12 months later, they look fine. 2 years later, they didn't look so good. 5 years later, many of them had PTSD, which they did not have a year or two afterwards. So that's delayed onset PTSD, and half the cases after the World Trade Center were of that type. So this veteran that I talk about in my book, The EFT Manual, he got worse and worse and worse after Vietnam, and eventually he saw a therapist. The therapist did EFT with him, which is, again, a body-based therapy. You use talk in EFT, but only to evoke emotion, and only to bring the emotion to the surface. You then use EFT, which involves acupressure, pressure with your fingertips on 13 points on the body. These are 2 over here. They're on the kidney acupuncture meridian. This is called K27 over here, and often we'll have people rub this or touch this as they talk about their issue. So they're talking about their issue, but now they're doing the rubbing or the tapping or the pressure, and that's helping them shift it using a body-based therapy. So this veteran, we'll call Don, he showed up in a therapist's office, and this was in the early 2000s. So it's now been 35 years since Vietnam. He's having flashbacks. He's having nightmares. He can't sleep through the night. In fact, after his first session with the therapist, he came back for a second session. And he said, after that first session you did with me, I got my first full night's sleep since Vietnam 35 years ago. That's the way PTSD affects people. And so after a few sessions, he then was willing to work on what he called the worst day of his life, the worst memory of Vietnam. It was the day his best friend got shot. And as he told the story, but he was doing the tapping during the story, as he told the story, he described how that particular day, the 2 of them went on patrol together. And every day they went on patrol together in their whole tour of duty, but they always had a pattern where he walked on the right and his friend walked on the left on patrol. But that day, for some unknown reason, they'd switched positions, and he was on the left and his friend was on the right. And his friend was killed by a sniper's bullet. Now, he won a medal. He was given a medal for his efforts to resuscitate his friend. It didn't work. His friend died. And so he'd had this terrible survivor's guilt now for 35 years because his friend had been where he usually was. So his story was, he took the bullet and it was meant for me. And so he'd had this terrible story going on in his mind for all these years, resulting in insomnia, hypervigilance, flashbacks. After tapping, after unpacking that event with his therapist while tapping, he suddenly had this epiphany. He just said, just the way I wished I'd been the one who had died there, we were like brothers. He would have wanted to take the bullet for me. And with that flip, we call it in psychology a cognitive shift. Same event, same stuff, bad stuff happened, but now you see it differently. That's what happens with EFT. But it wouldn't have happened with talking about things. It needed that body-based intervention of the acupressure. And what Joseph Walpy found after World War II, working with all of those veterans, he found after World War II, as he tried therapy after therapy after therapy, he tried method after method after method, he found talking didn't work, it was harmful, produced re-traumatization, but he found one thing that did work, and that was staying in your body, staying centered in your body. And he accomplished that back then with breathing. He used a special kind of breathing called diaphragmatic breathing. And when people would remember the trauma, but breathing anchored them in their bodies, it was also effective having them discharge the trauma. And so now we've done many randomized controlled trials of EFT, and there are actually 8 randomized controlled trials of EFT, many other non-randomized controlled clinical trials. There are over 100 trials of EFT. They show that in just 4 to 10 sessions, people are able to release those symptoms of flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance, and so on. And once they do that, they're better. They drop from an average of 64 on the scale we use to measure PTSD, where 85 is the max, 17 is the minimum. They drop from an average of 64 to an average of 32 after 6 EFT sessions. When we measure their progress at 6 months, at 12 months, that's still at 32. So the effects are permanent. And so it's wonderful we now have these body-based therapies, these movement and physical stimulation-based therapies, which can literally erase the trauma of that car crash, of that childhood bullying, whatever it is that you're carrying around with you and is unresolved and unhealed in your life. And I can tell you, if you don't use these techniques, if you don't heal yourself, if you carry that burden around with you, it takes a terrible toll on your body. Research into Vietnam veterans shows that Vietnam and also Iraq veterans, Gulf War veterans, they have higher levels of cancer, heart disease, all kinds of other diseases than the general population. And so it's so important for your health that you go and heal that trauma and do it now. If you're 30 years old, do it now. If you're 20 years old, do it now. If you're 70 years old, do it now. Don't carry that heavy burden around with you for a long, long time. You deserve a life that is free of the burden of trauma. You deserve a long life, a healthy life. And the way you get it is to use EFT and similar techniques to really release it. So we'll do a little bit of EFT at the end of my presentation. You'll feel the shifts in your body. You'll know that if you shifted one bad memory, which we'll do right now in the session, if you shifted one bad memory, you can shift a lot more. Now, I just want to give a word of caution here as well. I'm going to have you pick a memory to work on, but I'm also going to have you not pick a highly traumatic memory, because I don't want you to get flooded and overwhelmed. Often, if you think about a thing that's really serious, a terrible childhood trauma, you can become emotionally flooded. And you aren't with a therapist now. I'm not a therapist. I'm a life coach and a researcher. So this is not a therapy session, and we can't be your doctor or be your licensed mental health professional. So I'm going to have you pick something that's not too triggering. I'll have you pick standing in line at the post office, getting mad at how long the line is, or I'll have you getting cut off in traffic by another driver last week, something like that that's going to give you a rise in intensity, emotional intensity, but isn't going to overwhelm you. So we need to make sure you're safe. So please remember this as I'm talking about these events, as we're doing the exercise after this. I want you to remember to pick something that's manageable in this brief online session. Do not pick something that might open a can of worms you can't easily shut down again. So it's not that you'll never go and work on those things. You will, but you'll work on them usually with a therapist, or you'll work on them in a time frame where you have a couple of hours to do this. So there are always ways of doing it safely. So the big caveat here is we'll do the exercise, but just keep you in the comfort zone and in your own ability to handle your emotional triggering. We'll pick something with a minor amount of emotional content, not that overwhelming event. Okay? Promise me that. Promise you'll pick something that's not going to flood you or overwhelm you, because I can't help you with that. Now, we have hundreds of certified practitioners who can. There are lots of doctors in hospitals. The Veterans Administration, the VA in the US approved EFT for use in 2017. So after 10 years of trying, after 10 years of knocking on the VA's door, eventually we got EFT approved there. So you can go to your VA clinic, you can go to your VA hospital. Also, Kaiser Permanente huge hospital chain. Many hospital chains are now using EFT, offering EFT. So you can find EFT out there all over the place. But for right now, in this online session, make sure you pick something to work on that won't overwhelm you. So let's talk more now about people, about trauma, and why talk is not enough. When you look at brain scans, MRIs of people who've been traumatized, you see very similar patterns. And they are of one or two types. In one type of trauma, brain processing, a lot of the brain shuts down. It produces on that fight or flight or freeze continuum, it produces freeze. Some people, they remember the car crash, they remember the bitter divorce, they remember the death of a sibling, whatever it might be. They remember that thing, and the brain just goes numb. You just numb out. And that's a really adaptive way of dealing with trauma when you're 2 or 3 or 4. You want to numb out because you can't get away from your big brother who's beating up on you. You can't get away from being neglected by people who you want love from. What you can do to survive in that crazy family is you can numb out. So numbing out works great. It's a perfect strategy for the 3-year-old, the 4-year-old, the 5-year-old. But if you're still doing it at 50, then you're missing out on the chance to grow and heal that. So it's a great strategy for the 5-year-old. It's a really arrested development strategy for the 50-year-old. You need to now be an adult and heal those traumas so they don't come back in the form of heart disease or cancer or other kinds of problems. The giant Kaiser health system takes care of about 20 million people in the US. They did a study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, ACE study, and they found that adverse childhood experiences, like the kinds I've been mentioning, produced disease in adults. They found that when people came into the study at an average age of 57 years old, the more adverse childhood experiences they had, the higher their rates of heart disease, hepatitis, diabetes, cancer, being overweight, smoking. All these things were correlated with adverse childhood experiences. So that's why I became a missionary, a determined advocate of these body-based therapies. And that's what happens to the brain in the case of someone who freezes. The other possibility is that the emotional brain, the midbrain, the limbic system, will get all lit up. So the second kind of response you see in people is not freeze, it's the fight or flight response. And so you'll find the amygdala, the hippocampus, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, all of these structures in the emotional midbrain, they get highly aroused when people are remembering trauma. Now, they're meant to get aroused, and they're meant to get all triggered when you have a real trauma. If somebody is, like I watched a car weaving down the freeway a few weeks ago, and I think the driver must have been on drugs or very drunk. They were doing over 100 miles an hour, and they were weaving all over the road from the far lane, the speeding lane, to the slow lane, onto the shoulder and back again. Crazy driving. So I got hyper alert because I needed to make sure that this guy didn't involve me in an accident. So again, it was appropriate to have that big emotional response to that real threat. And that's an appropriate big emotional response. An inappropriate one would be, as I'm talking about this now, to still be going into fight or flight. So you want to make sure that you have appropriate responses, that you aren't going into fight or flight thinking about what your uncle said to you at Thanksgiving last year or 10 years ago. You're still agonizing about the stuff that's in the dim, distant past, and you're triggering all of these stress reactions in your brain, in your body. You also have a rise in stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. I've done several studies of cortisol and adrenaline and other kinds of stress factors. And we find people have a big rise in cortisol when they remember a bad event. Their cortisol can go way up. One nurse was in one of our clinical trials, and he happened to be randomized into the talk therapy group, so he wasn't getting a touch therapy. He was getting cognitive behavioral therapy, a talk therapy. And so after he had talked about a terrible disappointment in his life. He'd been engaged to a woman. He felt she was the love of his life, and she decided he wasn't the right match for her and that she was going to leave. And now, many years later, as he visualized her walking into the airport, where he saw her for the very last time, he was crying, he was upset, and it was years afterwards, his cortisol rose by almost 50% when he remembered that scene, and it stayed really high for a long time. So here he's driving his cortisol level high, making himself sick, and the event happened years ago. That's what happens when people's midbrains get emotionally aroused, not by a real threat or a real problem, but by a past problem or an imaginary threat. This might happen, this bad thing might happen, or this bad thing that happened in the past might happen again. So that's the other brain pattern we see, is a really aroused emotional midbrain. So you probably have one of those two responses yourself to the recollection, to the memory of trauma. I've even done studies on the epigenetic effects of this. Epigenetic means above the level of the gene. And these are things that are triggering gene expression, turning genes on that aren't in the cell, aren't even in the body. They're outside the cell or outside the body. So now maybe you remember the driver swerving all over the place, or maybe you remember the love of your life leaving. And that's producing an epigenetic effect where the genes of stress are literally being turned on. In one clinical trial I did with veterans, we found that there were many genes, that were stress genes, triggered by remembering stress. One of them is a group of genes called the interleukins, and they regulate inflammation in your body. So people who have high stress have lots of inflammation, and inflammation causes a range of degenerative diseases in your body. And again, after EFT treatment, it regulated those interleukins. It dialed down the inflammation in their bodies, not through talking, but through tapping, through using body-based therapies to help people heal. So these are literally having an effect on your body epigenetically. They are dialing down the level of stress, dialing down the level of inflammation, dialing down the level of stress gene expression, dialing up beneficial genes. Another clinical trial by a really inspired researcher looked at gene expression after a 1-hour EFT session. And she found that 72 genes were upregulated, were dialed up by EFT significantly. 72 genes were dialed up by EFT, turned on by EFT, including genes that code for suppressing cancer tumors, suppressing prostate cancer, suppressing breast cancer, throat cancer, bowel cancer, stomach cancer. All of these genes were being dialed up that suppress those cancers in your body. Genes that code for healthy brain function were being dialed up. Genes that code for memory and learning were dialed up. Genes that code for fertility were dialed up. Genes that code for immunity were dialed up. 72 genes dialed up from just 1 hour of what we'll be doing now in a therapy session. So it's powerful to use these therapies. They are epigenetic. They're affecting you down at the most fundamental levels of your body and your brain. So think about the way your brain works. Think about what your responses are. Now, when these people are either in shutdown, in freeze, or in fight or flight in their brains, different parts of the brain go dark, go quiet, or get active. And one part of the brain that gets active is the visual cortex. It's here in the back of your skull, is the visual cortex and the visual association cortex. Those parts of your brain are really active. So you're seeing that scene again. You're remembering your buddy getting killed in Vietnam. You're remembering the car crash when you were 25 years old. You're remembering being beaten by your older brother. You're remembering this vividly, and that part of your brain lights up. But there's another part of your brain that shuts down under trauma. And I talk about this in the EFT manual. I talk about which parts of the brain go dark, which ones light up. And one part of the brain that goes dark, that shuts down, is called Broca's area. It's right here behind your temples. And Broca's area is the one that governs language and speech, allows you to put words together. So now think about this. This person has had this nightmarish experience of a rape or an assault or a death or a tragedy or a disaster. And in their mind's eye, in their visual cortex, they're seeing it. They're seeing every detail of the disaster, but their Broca's area is shut down and they can't tell you. So you may think that they're okay. There are all these movies where the strong soldier says, or the strong warrior says, someone says to them after they've been injured, "Are you okay?" And they say, "Yeah, I'm okay." They got a piece of metal sticking out of their body, you know? It's crazy, you know, we're saying I'm okay, and we're not okay. Those people who've been traumatized are not okay. And unless they get good treatment, effective treatments with things like EFT, then they can go back to being really visibly not okay in a few years as that trauma accumulates. What happens is that when that traumatized brain is passing signals through the neural network, the parts of the brain that handle stress get bigger. That's a process called neurogenesis. We build new neurons along neural pathways we use a lot, and neural pathways we don't use, they start to crumble. So here the traumatized brain is sending signals through these emotional neural pathways. They're getting bigger and more effective at carrying the trauma, which is why PTSD gets worse over time. The parts of the brain to do with compassion, to do with connection with other people, to do with love, to do with memory and learning, those parts of the traumatized brain actually start to shrink as people go through those traumatic memories over time. But if they suppress those traumatic memories, if they release them, if they heal from them, then all the memory and learning and emotional regulation parts of the brain start to grow. In my book, Mind to Matter, in Mind to Matter, in chapter 1 of Mind to Matter, I talk about a guy called Graham Phillips. And Graham Phillips was a really reactive guy. He was a very successful guy. He's a TV journalist, but he was kind of a hard-bitten character, and he read about tools like meditation and acupressure, didn't really believe in them, but on air, on a TV show, decided to go ahead and test doing an 8-week mindfulness meditation program. But before he did it, he went into a university called Monash University, and a psychologist called Richard Chambers did a whole workup on Graham Phillips's brain, measuring the volume of neural tissue in each part of his brain. And he then began to practice meditation and mindfulness every day. He found after just 2 weeks, he felt quite different. He said, "I notice stress, I don't react to it anymore." After 8 weeks, he went back into Monash. Richard Chambers examined his brain exhaustively again in an MRI, and they found that in just 8 weeks, he'd had significant changes occurring in his brain, significant changes happening in his brain. Some areas grew by 2 or 3 or 4%, other areas shrunk. But the part of his brain that grew the most was a part called the dentate gyrus. Now, I'm going to say this number slowly because it's absolutely a stunning shift. The dentate gyrus handles emotional regulation and coordinates emotional regulation, regulating your anger, your fear, your doubt, your grief, your resentment. It regulates those emotions across multiple regions of the brain. And in 8 weeks, Graham Phillips's dentate gyrus, as measured by those MRI scans, his dentate gyrus added neural tissue over 8 weeks. It grew by 22.8%. Think about that. That's a growth of almost a fifth, more than a fifth, actually almost a quarter. It grew by 22.8% in just 2 months. That's how quickly your brain is remodeling itself based on your consciousness, your thoughts, and your stress reduction practices like meditation, like mindfulness, like EFT tapping. You're producing massive shifts in your brain. Where this came to roost to me, I'm going to close it by telling you one more story. And this is a story from my own life, and then we'll do the exercise. So I got a chance to put this into the test. Mind to Matter came out the book came out in June of 2017, and it immediately hit the #1 spot as the #1 best-selling book on Amazon in neuroscience. It stayed there for many, many weeks. It's been in the top 10 ever since, most of the time. And it's been amazing how Mind to Matter has motivated so many people to meditate and to tap. But in October of that year, with just this big run of success behind me, one night in October, I was sleeping soundly. My wife woke me up, shook me by the shoulder, and said, "Dawson, there's something really wrong." And so I kind of drowsily opened my eyes, and I looked at the clock. It was 12:45. We'd been sleeping for a couple of hours. And I looked out the window of our bedroom, and our property is just beautiful. It overlooks a gorgeous valley, rolling hills of wine country in Northern California. I looked out the bedroom window. I saw a glow on the ridge opposite us. So I quickly got out of bed, walked outside onto our deck, and as I watched, this wildfire was racing down the hillside toward our home. Now, I'm a pretty mellow guy. I'm a pretty chill human being. I get excited, but about all the wonderful things in life, I don't get too upset or annoyed usually. I don't usually swear or shout, or I'm not a dramatic type person. But when I said to my wife very loudly, "We're getting out of here right now," and we literally made split-second decisions about what to leave and what to take. Like, I got out of bed, looked at the fire, saw the fire. I ran to my clothes closet, and I knew I had time for either socks or shoes, but not both. I said, "Shoes." My wife was getting dressed. She said, "I have time for either a shirt or a jacket." Jacket. We sprinted out the front door, grabbing our car keys, our cell phones, and our laptops. And it was surreal outside. There was smoke in the air. The winds were gusting up to 80 miles an hour. And there was this, looked like a snowstorm of embers just horizontally sweeping across our driveway. And we had to run toward the fire because we have an office building in the back of our property, and we needed to get to the fire, get to the car parked by the office building, which was all the way at the opposite end of the property, a long way away from the house. We had sprinted toward the car, jumped in the car, drove like crazy down our long driveway out into the road, and about 2 or 3 miles away, I realized we were safe. I slowed down, and but as we drove down the driveway, my wife was thinking, "Why is my head getting so hot?" And she looked up through the moonroof, and all the trees above her were on fire. And so we drove out through this crazy scene, this inferno. We eventually were safe, and we were very disoriented for the first couple of days. A friend of ours, the National Guard, sealed off the area. We were staying in a hotel about 30 miles away. A friend of ours snuck in through the National Guard posts and took a photograph of our property. We texted her and we said, "Was the house damaged by the fire?" She texted us back a photograph, and there was nothing standing except the chimney. The chimney was there, but nothing of the storerooms, the office building, the garage. There was just ash. That was all there was, and the chimney. So we were traumatized, and 5,300 houses burned down that night. It was a major wildfire. 22 people died in the wildfire. 8 of them died within 1,000 yards of our house. They were trapped in their cars. When the power went out, they couldn't get out of their garages, all kinds of tragedies. So we felt really grateful to have survived the wildfire. But we were traumatized. But we were also resilient. So a few days later, I said to Christine, we woke up that morning in the hotel by the coast, and I said to her, "Darling, we have to do one thing right now, right this moment, and we need to tap and meditate." So we tapped and we meditated. We did EFT, we did meditation, and we literally felt ourselves dropping into our bodies. Now, the next few months were very difficult for us in many ways. They were difficult emotionally. They were difficult financially. We had a lot of issues to deal with in our lives, but we were happy. We were resilient people. We built that neural tissue in our neural network. So a year from then, a year later, there were all these articles in the paper about the suffering, about the tragedy of people in the fire. And we felt for it and we lived through it. But we were resilient. We felt loved. We felt supported. We felt protected. We felt grateful. All of those things right afterwards, because we built that neural tissue of resilience. So I want you to do these things so you are resilient. You never know when things might happen. That could be diagnosed with a disease. There'll be another recession. There's an economic cycle, and it's called the economic cycle because it goes up and it goes down. There are big crashes that happen. How resilient are you in the face of that? When a loved one dies, when somebody you love leaves you, when you lose your job, when you lose your money, when your 401k retirement plan goes down, how do you feel? Are you resilient? I want you to have this neural tissue and grow that neural tissue in your brain like Graham Phillips did. Have that 22.8% increase in volume in your dentate gyrus in 8 weeks. So you become a resilient person because you don't know what will happen in the future, but you can happen in the future as a very different person if you have practiced these trauma release techniques like the one I'm going to show you. So talk is valuable. Talk has a place. But when it comes to trauma, you need epigenetic interventions like EFT, like meditation, that are literally changing gene expression in your body, bringing down your stress hormones. I did a study at Esalen Institute because I teach workshops all over the world. I teach them in Europe frequently. I teach them on the East Coast of the US, on the West Coast, teach them in various places. And we did a study at Esalen during a workshop of mine there. We measured people's levels of cortisol and their levels of another substance called immunoglobulin before and after a week-long workshop. So at the start of each day, they were meditating. Throughout the day, they were tapping to release trauma. And after just 1 week, their baseline level of cortisol had dropped by 37%. The lab that analyzes these cortisol samples for me, they're always amazed. They say, Dr. Church, wow, we're just absolutely blown away by the drops in cortisol because we've never seen this happen with any other therapy before. So people's levels of cortisol dropped over the course of a week by 37%. We also measure their levels of immunoglobulin. And immunoglobulins are substances found in your saliva, they're found in your gut, they're found in the mucous membranes of your body, they're found in all of these key places in your body, and they help you with immunity to pathogens and toxins. They bind to bacteria and viruses coming in from the environment, dust mites and smoke and pollutants. Immunoglobulins bind to all these things and neutralize them so they can't infect you. So as people's levels of cortisol dropped by 37% over the course of 1 week of tapping and meditation in the study, it freed up those biological precursors for good things like immunoglobulin. Their immunoglobulin rose in that week by 113%. That's more than doubling of their immune response. That means that when the colds and flu are going around, they don't get you. You've doubled your immune system just by doing these simple exercises like meditation and like tapping. So I really want you to have the immune benefit, the health benefit, and the peace of mind that goes along with it. This is very, very different for you. So you have two paths before you right now. You have a fork in the road right this very moment. In this instant, either you're going to commit to doing these things, or you're going to say, gee, Dawson Church, inspirational talk, and I'll put this on the shelf till later. Don't do that. Start these practices right now. If we were doing a live workshop, I'd be having you raise your hand and say, I commit to doing this every day. I'm going to meditate and tap every morning for 10 to 20 minutes. That's all I ask of you. So I'm asking you now to mentally raise your hand and make a commitment. You owe it to yourself. You'll have a far longer and happier and healthier life if you just do this. So do those things. Do those practices. In Mind to Matter, I have 30 other practices like walking in nature and grounding and clean eating. There are all kinds of other things you can do. But at minimum, do EFT and do meditation, because those things are powerful in shifting the needle. Commit to them, and they will shift your whole life. So make that commitment, not just to be inspired, but be inspired to literally change and do those practices. You'll feel how when you get past the talk and shift into a body-based practice like this, you'll literally feel your sensations in your body change. You'll feel the energy change, and you'll feel the physiology change as you're lowering cortisol, raising immunoglobulins, and helping yourself feeling really good. So now's the time for us to do that practice. And I want you to find yourself a really calm space to do this in. We'll spend about 15 minutes doing this. And this is the key way to release that trauma from your life. Again, please pick an event to work on that is not a huge tragedy that might overwhelm you emotionally. Pick something manageable. And Joseph Walpe, as he was working with those World War II veterans, used a scale called SUD, or Subjective Units of Distress. And I tell you how to use this in more detail in my book, The EFT Manual, but it's a very simple scale. And for right now, just give your degree of emotional distress a rating from 0 to 10. So 0 means I have no emotional distress. I'm thinking about the car crash, I'm thinking about that bad event, and I'm calm. Then give yourself a number on that scale where 10 is I'm thinking about the car crash, I'm thinking about the childhood event, I'm thinking about whatever it might have been, and I'm as emotionally charged as I possibly could be. I'm as anxious, as angry, as stressed. I'm a 10 out of 10 for stress. Or where are you right now? So pick an event that is a 4 or less. So again, pick waiting in the post office and having someone be slow in line. Oh, I'll tell you a funny one from my life. I was at an airport last week, and there was a long line to order this really delicious food at this Mexican restaurant. And it was takeout, it was stand-up takeout. So there was a line, maybe 12, 14 people long, and they had a big display with all of their food there. And so I had to wait quite a while for my turn to order. So I waited, and I was, a little bit impatient, but looked at what I wanted to order. I knew what I was going to get, 3 tacos, and so I'm all ready to order when it came to be my turn. There were these 2 ladies in front of me, and they were really good friends. They seemed like really sweet ladies. But anyway, eventually, after waiting through this long line, it was their turn to order. And then after waiting in line for 15 minutes, they turned to each other, looked at the menu up behind the wait staff, and the one turned to the other and said, "Gee, what do you think we should have? Do you think we should choose the burritos, or the tacos look good as well?" And they then had a long conversation trying to make up their minds while there were 15 people behind them waiting to place their orders. They just stood there chatting away, having this extended talk, talking to the waitress about what the ingredients were. I'm thinking, hey, gals, you had a quarter of an hour to make up your minds, and now you're just starting the process. So my number went up to like a 4. So that's a good example of something to tap on. Tap on the 2 ladies making up their minds in the line. Don't pick having your leg broken in a car crash when you were 4 years old. That's too big to pick on. So pick something that's a 4 or below, and you will feel your numbers go down. So you've got your event, 4 or below, and you've got your number. Now I want you to give your event a name, and the name should capture the essence of the emotional energy. So my name for my event is The 2 Ladies. Okay, so the 2 ladies, those 2 words capture the emotion and get my limbic system, my midbrain all lit up. So I'm all lit up now when I think about the two ladies. This is for real. I really am before around the two ladies. I'm not just pretending over here. So you've got your number, you've got your event name, and we'll now walk you through this procedure where you release that stress. So first of all, start by tapping on the side of your hand over here. And again, there are 13 points I'll show you in the EFT manual. We'll only work on a few of those today, and these are likely to be helpful to you. So while you tap here, just think about the event. If you can say this out loud, do it. And just say the words, even though I had this bad experience, I deeply and completely accept myself. Even though I had this bad experience, out loud, if you are able to do that, I am safe now. Even though I had this bad experience, that was then, now is now, and I'm safe now. I had this bad experience, and I survived. I made it through. Okay, take a deep breath. Now tap on the top of your head, gently, and just say out loud the name of your bad experience. This bad experience, and I'll say the two ladies. You can say whatever your words are that encapsulate the emotional energy of the experience for you. So I'm saying the two ladies. You're saying the name of your event. Now tap right, with two fingers, tap right where your eyebrow meets the bridge of your nose. The bad event. Vividly remember the bad event. The bad event, for me, the two ladies. For you, whatever your bad event was. Now tap on the side of your eye. The bad event. That bad event. Name it. Tap under the pupil of your eye. That bad event. That bad event. Tap under your nose. That bad event. That bad event. Tap on your chin. That event should never have happened. Should never have happened to me. Tap where your collarbone meets your breastbone. That bad event. Remember the bad event vividly. Then tap under your arm about 4 inches below your armpit. Again, vividly recalling the bad event. And then one more time over here. Now, while you're tapping here, think back to the bad event, in my case, the two ladies, and measure your triggering on a scale from 10 to 0, where 10 is maximum stress and 0 is complete calm. Right now, I'm just tuning back into my two ladies event and thinking what my number is, and it's maybe, now I'm kind of laughing at myself. I'm just laughing at myself, laughing at my own. It's just a minor thing. I had plenty of time. I wasn't really in a rush. So I'm maybe 1 around it right now. But you probably still have a little bit of charge. So we'll tap on the remaining charge. Even though I have some remaining charge around this event, it's in the past, and I survived. I'm remembering the event vividly.
I'm remembering the event vividly.
And I'm safe now.
And I'm safe now.
That was the past.
That was the past.
And now is now.
And now is now.
I survived that bad event.
I survived that bad event.
And I am me.
And I am me.
And I love and accept me.
And I love and accept me.
the bad event. The bad event. The bad event. I still have a little bit of charge around this bad event.
I still have a little bit of charge around this bad event.
It's come down.
It's come down.
I'm safe now.
I'm safe now.
Even though I'm vividly recalling the bad event.
Even though I'm vividly recalling the bad event.
And your arm about 4 inches down, the bad event. One more time over here. Okay, so I'm thinking back to my 2 ladies. I'm at a 0. I'm remembering the color. The one had a green and white striped dress. The other had little roses on her dress, on her blouse. Thinking about their hair, thinking about their voices, and I'm pretty much not bothered by it anymore. Christine, I'm really curious. You don't have to disclose what your event was if you don't want to, but what were your opening and closing numbers after tapping?
Well, so I got to a 4. I was at a 4. I was mining for that event that took me to a 4. And then after that first pass, I was at a 2. And then you were saying, okay, there still might be some charge. And that's when I felt like, oh, okay, good. I have a chance to go back in. And sure enough, it dropped away. I felt after that first pass that I was removed from it. Like I was in a theater watching something happen. And there was a little bit of charge that was happening. But now it feels like there's like a physical experience of more spaciousness.
Yes.
Is that common?
That's very common. What's going on in the brain is very interesting. And we find that when people remember the bad stuff, again, their emotional brain gets all lit up. And so now you're remembering something. And so that is a signal to your emotional brain that there's possible danger, possible stress, possible trauma. If you then tap, that sends a second signal to your brain. And that is a calming signal because tapping is calming on these acupuncture points. So now your brain's getting 2 signals. One is saying, freak out. One's saying, be calm. So the memory signal from the past traumatic event is saying, freak out. The tapping is saying, be calm. And the brain understands below the level of thought, below the level of words, that the tapping and the physical stimulation is the real signal to pay attention to, not the imaginary memory. Because if you were really having a threat, if you were being chased by a tiger, then you wouldn't be tapping. So it understands now that this memory of thinking about the tigers and paper tigers in the world is not a threat to your survival. So it prioritizes the physical signal. So that's why the theme of this whole presentation is when talk is not enough, because talk won't do this. If someone's upset and angry, triggered, and you say, there's no reason to be upset about these 2 ladies, calm down. It's like, no, I'm not calming down. I'm not calm. I know I shouldn't be angry. I know I should be compassionate, but I can't really calm myself, even though I know I should be screaming and yelling at my 8-year-old. So what you do is you do the physical sensation, and that neutralizes the memory or the cognitive processing of the bad thing. It's at the level of the body. It tells the brain that you're safe. Once you break the association between having the memory and going into fight or flight, one time the brain realizes, oh, this memory is not a cue, a stimulus to go into fight or flight the next time around as well. That's how it works in the brain.
That's a beautiful process, because I have experienced moments where a memory will just wash over me from out of nowhere. Yeah. And I'll find that my breathing is short and that I'm just kind of sitting there hostage to the memory, like even without knowing it. It's like I'm hijacked for a moment, and it takes some doing to come conscious again to it. And so I'm wondering if this is a sort of practice that, is it something that I can use like just to start my day or to go throughout the day? Is it also something like self-soothing, or is it a focused, applied practice that you're suggesting here?
It is used in several different ways. One is that it's a great tool to use in the moment when you're stressed. Like I was doing a healing circle, group therapy circle at Fort Hood in Texas. It's the biggest military base in Texas. And one of the soldiers there with PTSD, these are all people who've been diagnosed with PTSD, about half men, half women. Mostly they'd served in Iraq or Afghanistan, gotten back with PTSD. And so one of the young men then said, he was so angry, he said, the guard at the gate this morning, he was so angry I wanted to pull my sidearm and shoot him. Like, wow, okay, let's do some tapping on that. So that's like a momentary event when he could, rather than getting all angry, he can tap in the moment. So when you get annoyed or irritated in the moment. So that's one way of tapping. But a really great way to tap is proactively. So what you do in that case is you proactively, usually with a therapist or a coach certified, it's called clinical EFT. There are millions of people, the thousands of people who are EFT practitioners. But those who've got clinical certification, they're called clinical EFT practitioners. They've got certification, proper training how to do EFT. So what they'll do is they'll have you bring up lists of problems in your past, and you will be working on the traumas that are a 10 out of 10. They'll literally have you bring those lists into the therapy session, and they'll work with you through those lists one after the other. And we've done this now with so many veterans, and they literally walk into the therapy session with a list of things they want to work on. The therapist starts at the top, and you tap, and you work your way down the list. We've done this with highly traumatized people. We sent a volunteer team into Haiti after the 2010 earthquake there, which left 250,000 children orphaned. There were suddenly 250,000 children orphaned in Haiti, and that's the poorest country in the world. So we sent a team in there, and it's just so touching. I almost have tears in my eyes thinking about these little kids, and they learn to tap. They learn to sing a song about tapping. And like one little girl had been so traumatized that in the 2 years since the earthquake, her mom was killed in the earthquake. Her mom was actually in the same building as she was. The building collapsed. The mom was killed. This little girl was trapped in the rubble 2 days before they dug her out, and with her mom's body. It was horrible. And she hadn't spoken a single word in the 2 years since the earthquake. Then she starts to tap. She was actually tapping, and she began talking to a teddy bear, and then talking to the priest and the nuns and the tappers and other people. And by the end of the session, she was playing with the other kids. She'd really released the trauma. So it's so powerful to see people apply this to those real life situations. So you go back and you remember all the bad things of your past, and you then tap on them one after the other proactively in an hour-long or 2-hour-long session. And after, we find these veterans, after 5-10 sessions, they've tapped it all away, and they're sleeping properly, they're digesting properly, they have normal function of all of their systems. It's a powerful way to use EFT proactively. So either reactively, when you're in line behind the two ladies, or proactively going back into your childhood and clearing it all out. I also use it before meditation each morning. So each morning I do a little bit of tapping before I meditate to tap away weird dreams I've had or any kind of worries about the day. Tap before you meditate, and then that helps you disperse those things so you have a clear space for that meditation you do.
When you mentioned PTSD and the delayed emergence of trauma, I had thought about that in terms of perhaps being safe enough in one's body to then handle something that emerges like that. Because it would seem to me that our coping skills kind of press down difficult emotions or difficult experiences. And when we're safe enough for it to come up, then, okay, that's when we can handle it. And I'm wondering, and this is just my own thought around that, is there something actually to that? I mean, what what is behind the delayed emergence of trauma based on the research that you've found on the subject?
Yeah, the delayed onset PTSD is because of neuroplasticity. And so when neuroplasticity was first discovered in human beings in the 1960s and really got it was discovered in the 1960s, but the whole neuroscience and brain research community was so against the idea. They didn't believe that your brain was able to make new neurons when you were an adult. So the research was so opposed that neuroplasticity wasn't like rediscovered until the 1990s, but it was discovered actually in the 1960s that our brains are making new neurons all the time along neural pathways that we use frequently. So if you're having a traumatic memory over and over and over again, or traumatic reaction over and over and over again, your brain starts to build more and more capacity along that pathway, and those parts of your brain start to grow and signal faster. And so you do that for a month, just the way Graham Phillips's emotional regulation part of his brain grew. We find that traumatized veterans, for example, the memory and learning centers of their brain start to shrink over time. So now they can't remember things, they can't learn new skills, but the trauma conduits, trauma circuits of their brain get bigger and bigger and bigger and faster and faster and faster. Keep that up for 5, 10 years, suddenly we have a nonprofit where we've treated now over 20,000 veterans with PTSD, because even though the VA at last accepted EFT, approved it in 2017, it had actually been against it since the early 2000s. And so we formed a nonprofit called the Veteran Stress Project, where we've now treated over 20,000 veterans with PTSD. And so as we work with them, we find many of them are getting worse over time. We'll get a phone call, for example, from the daughter of a veteran, and she'll say, it's been 40 years since Vietnam, and Dad's getting crazier and crazier as time goes on, because those trauma circuits are being used more, and now it's the dark side of neural plasticity. They're just making more and more neural tissue there. It's not the memory and learning centers, it's not the emotional regulation centers that are growing in the brain. It's those centers now that are shrinking as that veteran processes the trauma. So that's why PTSD does not get better over time the way depression or anxiety does. It often gets worse.
Mm-hmm. You were talking about combining this practice of tapping with meditation. And
Yes.
Can you say a little bit about what that might look like for us, as for those of us who have taken this pledge to begin this practice?
Well, I am a failed meditator, Christy. I remember when I was 15 years old, I joined a spiritual community, and I just spent many years then in retreats and learning about all the world's great spiritual traditions, meditating, doing energy healing. And I remember the spiritual teacher saying, meditation is simple. All you do is close your eyes and still your mind. I'm like, still my mind? When I close my eyes, my mind just goes crazy. And I think about all kinds of things. I can't still my mind. We now know there's a part of the brain called the default mode network, which kicks in when you close your eyes and when you aren't doing much. And the default mode network does two things. One is it thinks about all the bad stuff in your past, and it also thinks, the second thing it does is it imagines all the bad stuff that might happen in your future. And that's the mode our brains default to when we are doing a task. So you close your eyes, try and meditate, and you can't still your mind. The default mode network kicks in, and then you are thinking all these thoughts about bad stuff in the past and possible bad stuff in the future. So meditation's hard, and I just failed miserably at it for about 30 years. But I then began to study these physiological techniques, and I developed a form of meditation called ECO meditation, ECO meditation. It's free. It's now been used by thousands of people We get a huge amount of traffic on the Eco Meditation website because you don't still your mind. You can't still your mind, basically, unless you're a really advanced yogi. So we have you instead do things like tapping, like relaxing certain muscles that give you physical postures. So my personal practice is I wake up in the morning, do a little bit of tapping to release, but I do about an hour of Eco Meditation. Now, you don't have to do an hour. 10 minutes is just fine, but it's a really simple way of moving to the same state as an advanced yogi without stilling your mind and without needing to do any kind of spiritual practice. So it's a very powerful way of getting straight to the goal of stress reduction. Then throughout the day, you tap. So those are my two fundamental practices. Now, I also do other things. I eat a good diet. I take supplements. I maintain a wonderful relationship with my wife and my team and people in my world around me. I seek out people who are in really loving, compassionate, kind, emotional states, highly creative people. I spend time with them. And if there are people who are drama queens and stressed, I avoid them. I don't want them in my energy field. So I just cut out the people. I talk a lot about this in my book, Mind to Matter. It's emotional contagion. And emotions, it turns out in research, shows are as contagious as disease. Emotions, whether positive or negative, affect you. So if you're with negative people, you will be affected by the negativity. If you're with positive people, you're affected by them. In the research I cover in Mind to Matter, I even show that Facebook and YouTube and Instagram and Pinterest and social media, Twitter, all of these ways are producing massive emotional contagion in society, not just positive, but also negative. If there's a negative tweet, it affects the emotions of potentially millions of people negatively. A positive tweet, positive post does the reverse and affects people. So you want to be with people who are agents of positive emotional contagion and be one yourself. And the way to do that is to start with meditation and then tap away anything that happens that's bad during the course of the day. Do those practices. Glad you raised your hand.
I did. I did.
You'll feel your body shift. Raise both hands. That's great.
I'm in. One thing that you did not mention in this multi-pronged approach to peace and groundedness was visualization. And
Yes.
I'd like to share that before we went into the broadcast, you spent a beautiful moment going into a visualization about everyone who is participating with us here today, really receiving the benefit of this teaching and just surrounding them in love. And I wanted to just talk about the importance of visualization in this work and in general.
Yeah, and in my book, Mind to Matter, I list 30 practices that research shows will improve your life epigenetically, hormonally, brain function, and health. And visualization is one of those. And it's a powerful, powerful tool. There are 30 of them. And I give you all 30, not because you need to do all 30 of them, but because some people find they have an affinity for one or more of them, but not so much the others. My wife, for example, does yoga. She just loves doing yoga. It's yoga that really works for her. Visualization, not so much. For me, visualization is big. And I do yoga sometimes, but it doesn't move the needle for me as much. So I urge you to experiment with all of those 30 methods in Mind to Matter and then put together a menu of ones that work for you. It's like going through the buffet line. And you go through the buffet, you discover you like certain foods, don't like certain foods. You pick the foods you like. So go try all 30 flavors and then pick the 2 or 3 that work for your lifestyle. If you're a single mom, like we had a woman called Toni Tomlinson who wrote into us recently, sent us an email and said, Dawson, I heard about Eco Meditation, went on the site, and I didn't think it would work for me because I'm really stressed, I'm really burned out, parenting, and I try to meditate for years, and I just can't do it. When I close my eyes, just remember all of my stressors, and I get even worse. So she said, when I did those 7 steps of Eco Meditation, suddenly my heart cracked open, tears of bliss began to roll down my cheeks, and I was there. And so we wanted to have that experience of being there. And then we have an experience one time. It's usually feels so good, you're then motivated to do it. So for Tony, an hour meditation as a mom is not going to work. But she said, I'm committing now to doing eco meditation every single day. And she may only do it for 10 or 20 minutes. That's totally fine. You'll get a lot of benefit from that. There's no need to have a long meditation practice. So just trying all 30 flavors and then picking the ones that fit for your lifestyle, that's the thing to do.
You know, I was actually going to ask you about that. Busy parents, single moms, people in high stress jobs who seem to be experiencing a high or recurring level of stress in their lives. I was wondering about the application there. And is there any more that you have to share about that's for someone who is looking for tools to manage that stress?
Yes. And often we're looking for tools to manage that stress from the outside. We're looking at something else having to change out there for us to be less stressed. And it's very, very powerful to instead find things in here. Because if you need your boss to change, or your kids to change, or your money to change, or your home environment to change for you to feel happy, you're taking your power of your happiness and handing it to somebody else, handing it to your boss, handing it to the government, handing it to the president, handing it to the corporations, handing it to your wife or your kids or the school district. And that is not the way to get happy. That's, in fact, a guaranteed way to stay unhappy, because you're giving the key to your happiness to somebody else outside of yourself. You need to learn to draw the key to your happiness back into your own heart and mind and body. So you want to do things, practices that you have control over, where you can reduce your stress regardless of how they are. You aren't going to change all of those outside things. You aren't going to change those governments or corporations or people. I mean, I can't even change my wife.
It's good.
Or my kids.
It's good you realize that. It's good you realize that. Yes.
Yeah, my power to change people stops at my own skin, and perhaps people who are listening today. So if you're in a high-stress job, a high-stress relationship, a high-stress situation, pull the power back into yourself and use tapping, use meditation to be far more centered and balanced. I mean, there was nothing imaginably higher stress for me than having my house just burned down. But when you have the tools and you realize the power is inside of you to be happy, we made ourselves happy within a few days. We were centered, we were focused, we felt full of love, we felt protected, we celebrated our blessings, and we continue to do that now, even though it's been more than a year since the fire. So you become resilient when you use these things, even if you're in a really high stress situation.
And so is resilience then the base for receptivity to all this sort of change that we want to create? Because I was watching you in an interview share a story about having lost your keys while you were... Can you share that and what happened and how you just tried to stay open and calm and hold the vision of finding your keys?
Well, I'm a researcher, and yet, even though I love science and I do science, I live and breathe science, I believe in all kinds of phenomena that science proves that many scientists would call woo-woo. And one of those is synchronicity. And so one of the things I found is that I have a highly synchronous life. I pretty much wake up in the morning, I meditate, I do my tapping, I have my breakfast, I go to my office, I start doing stuff, and then just events happen, amazing synchronous events. And I tell that story in the first chapter of my book, Mind Matter, because it was one of those events that really shook my belief system to the core and made me a believer in this. And what happened was I was working on another book many years ago under a tight deadline from the publisher, and I realized I wasn't going to get done in my office. So I thought I'll just fly to Hawaii, spend 2 weeks in a condo, focus on the book right there, and without any distractions, just me and my laptop, I'll write the book there in Hawaii. So I flew to Hawaii, and then as well as writing, I also took walks on the beach. And I love scuba diving and snorkeling. So each day I rented a Jeep. I had all my scuba diving and snorkeling equipment in the back of the Jeep. I just drive out to a beautiful beach when I wanted to take a break from writing, and I unlock the back of the Jeep. I put on my gear. I then go for snorkeling for an hour or so, then go back to the Jeep, back to the condo, refreshed, and write some more. So I did this one day at a beautiful bay called Lauai Beach. It has a turtle colony, has a reef that's about a half-mile long, beautiful spot in the south of the island of Kauai. And I had an amazing time. I was diving down to the bottom, which is about 6 to 12 feet down. There was all these beautiful corals there, just coral heads. So some of them are 4 or 5 feet high. And I just had a wonderful swim. And then I swam back to the shore, went back to the Jeep, and I stuck my hand in my pocket to grab the car keys, and my pocket was empty. And not only were my car keys, and had they been in my pocket, but I clipped to the same key ring the keys to the condominium I was staying in. So now I was locked out of the car, and I was locked out of my condo. I thought, oh, no big deal. I won't panic. I'll stay in my heart. I'll keep breathing, and I'll just walk down to the beach. I'm sure I just dropped them probably in the men's change room or something. So I walked down there. They weren't in the men's change room, weren't on the beach. So I thought, well, I'm just going to swim around out here. But again, this is a half-mile wide bay. It's maybe a quarter-mile square. So I swam out there, and I'm looking at coral heads 6 to 12 feet down, looking for a key, 2 keys on a ring. And eventually, after an hour or so of swimming around, I realized there's no way you can find this thing this way. And I stayed totally calm, stayed in my heart, stayed centered. And it was getting dark, and dusk was falling. I realized I couldn't see anything down there anyway. So I swam back to the beach to get out. And a father and his 3 teenage sons had just gone into the water for a last-minute swim at the end of the day. And they'd been diving down. I noticed them diving as I was watching them. And my intuition said, talk to those 4 men. So I swam over to them, and I said to them, I've seen you guys diving down and diving back up again for the last little while. Did you by any chance find anything down there in the bottom? And the youngest boy held up my keys. And I have these synchronicities every day, sometimes multiple ones in a day. And what research is now showing, and Mind to Matter, and my book is all about this, all the science of synchronicity, is when you notice synchronicity and when you focus on synchronicity, research shows you literally have more of it in your life. If you believe in clairvoyance and telepathy and distant healing and all of these woo-woo things, there's huge amounts of scientific evidence proving all of these things. If you believe in them, you have more of them. If you don't believe in them, you have less of them. It's an amazing thing here. And we find, Christy, that all of these ways are there of living a synchronous life. When you attune yourself to the universe in meditation every day, you live a synchronous life. Your whole life becomes governed by this wonderful universe we live in, and you find synchronicity just happens.
What a fantastic validation of the wisdom of our bodies, eh?
Yeah.
Dr. Dawson Church, thank you so much for that. That was really fun. It was exciting, and I am ready to get going on my practice.
Love it. Yeah, please do.
So once again, I want to thank Dawson Church. And I also want to thank those of you who joined us for this session. Please note that the recording of this session will remain accessible for free for 24 hours. And if you wish, you can purchase the entire summit with lifetime access to each recording, transcripts from each session, and bonus gifts from our presenters. If it sounds true, I'm Christy Peoples, thanking you again for being with us, and thanking Dr. Dawson Church, too. SoundsTrue.com, waking up the world.